Change community. Today we're going to have the second part of a very short series about an extremely important topic that we call forgiveness. You know, everybody's going to mess up in life, so everybody's going to need to be forgiven by somebody. And then the people around us, they're all going to mess up in life, and they're going to need to be forgiven by us. But I'm convinced before we ever understand how the dynamic of forgiveness works between people, we must understand how forgiveness works between us and God. God wanted us to get this concept, and so way before we ever realized we needed a forgiver, God sent a forgiver. He sent His Son Jesus to bear our sin, to take it all on Him. He carried that to a cross and He died with it there. Now, I'm not going to get overly theological or overly spiritual, but it's an extremely important topic in life. How do we get our hearts clean? How do we get guilt removed? How do we get shame washed out of our life? How do we become convinced that we've been forgiven so that we can forgive ourselves? Now, if you've never had a problem with this, if you've never needed extreme forgiveness, if you never struggled with forgiving yourself for something, then you can click the off button right now. But I imagine almost everybody watching this has had a time in life where you needed to know that you were forgiven and you needed to learn how to forgive yourself. God had forgiveness in His heart before you and I ever had sin on our mind. Before you ever thought about it. Before I ever thought about it, let alone do it. Before we had it on our mind, God knew that He was going to need to forgive. You say, now Brad, how do you know that? Well, take the Old Testament. The Bible is divided into two parts. The New Testament, which we know a lot about, the life of Jesus and the writings of Paul and all of that. And then you have the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all the kings and the judges and the prophets, that kind of stuff. In the Old Testament, woven throughout in a very consistent theme, is the sacrificial system. This is where people would take animals, depending on the gravity of their sin or their own personal economy. They would either bring a lot of animals and big animals, or very few animals and small animals. And again, depending on what they'd done and what they could afford, they would bring these animals to an altar, and there a priest would take them, and a priest would sacrifice the animal, because the firm belief throughout that system was that without the shedding of blood, sin can't be forgiven. Let me say it in our language. Sin has a price. We ask sometimes when we talk about forgiveness, it seems like God forgives pretty easily, not easily at all. Sin has a price, and God exacted an excruciating, horrific, terrible price in and through the life of His own Son, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one of God. He paid our sin price. The Old Testament stood as centuries of preparation so that we would understand the tremendous sacrifice. That's why God gave us the sacrificial system, just so we'd understand Jesus and the sacrifice that He was making for you and for me so that we could be forgiven. God's been in the forgiving business ever since He's been God. And before there were people who needed to be forgiven, God had forgiveness on His heart. It's His character. It's His nature. He loves to forgive. He'll forgive you. We're going to be talking for a couple of more days about this, and I hope you'll stay tuned. Today, get this point. God's been thinking about this a long time. God's been doing this a long time. And God is fully capable and more than willing to forgive you for anything you need, if you'll ask Him. That'll change your life. And that's why there's Life Change Community. I hope you'll be back tomorrow.